The sound of the auctioneer's gavel echoed through the dusty courthouse like a death knell, and Thomas Trent knew he was about to do something everyone would call foolish. The land parcels were going fast that spring morning in 1878, but nobody wanted the stretch of scrubland 15 miles north of Chisum Ranch, New Mexico. They said it was cursed, that the previous owner had gone mad from isolation, that the earth itself was poisoned and nothing would grow there except tumbleweeds and regret. Thomas raised his hand anyway. The auctioneer squinted at him through the haze of tobacco smoke. "You serious, son?" "Dead serious," Thomas replied, his voice steady despite the skeptical murmurs rippling through the crowd. "Sold for $40 to the fool in the back," the auctioneer announced with a shake of his head. Thomas ignored the laughter as he pushed through the crowd to sign the papers. At 26 years old, he had spent the last 8 years working cattle drives from Texas to Kansas, saving every penny he could spare. $40 was a pittance compared to what he had saved, and he knew something those townspeople did not. He had ridden past that land dozens of times, and while it looked harsh and unforgiving on the surface, he had seen the way water collected in the low places after the rains, had noticed the hardy grass that grew in scattered patches. It just needed someone willing to work it, to coax life from the stubborn earth. 3 days later, Thomas loaded his supplies onto a wagon and set out before dawn. The road north was little more than wagon ruts through red dirt, flanked by sagebrush and occasional stands of scrub oak. The spring sun climbed higher as his horse pulled the wagon steadily forward, and by mid-morning the air shimmered with heat that promised a scorching summer ahead. He passed a few scattered homesteads, their occupants watching him with expressions ranging from pity to amusement. Let them think what they wanted. Thomas had learned long ago that other people's opinions would not put food on his table or a roof over his head. The land revealed itself gradually as he traveled, the terrain growing rougher and more isolated with each passing mile. He spotted deer tracks near a dry creek bed and made a mental note that water had flowed there recently. A hawk circled overhead, which meant prey animals lived in the area. These were good signs, signs that a man could make a life here if he was willing to work for it. The boundary of his property was marked by a fallen fence post and a line of scraggly juniper trees. Thomas stopped the wagon and climbed down, his boots raising small clouds of dust as he surveyed what was now his land. The acreage stretched out before him, 200 acres of possibility mixed with hardship. In the distance, perhaps a quarter mile from the road, stood the abandoned barn everyone had mentioned during the auction. It leaned slightly to one side like an old man favoring a bad leg, its weathered wood bleached silver by countless seasons of sun and wind. Thomas decided to inspect the barn first, before choosing where to set up his camp. He urged the horse forward along an overgrown path, watching for snake holes and prairie dog burrows that could break an axle or lame his animal. As he drew closer, he could see the barn was larger than he had expected, a sturdy structure despite its neglected appearance. The previous owner had at least built something solid, even if he had not stayed to maintain it. He pulled the wagon to a stop 30 feet from the barn entrance and set the brake. The silence out here was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the grass and the distant cry of a bird. Thomas grabbed his rifle from behind the seat, more out of habit than any real expectation of danger, and approached the barn carefully. The large doors hung open, one dangling from a single hinge. He paused at the threshold, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness inside. Shafts of sunlight pierced through gaps in the walls and roof, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. The barn was mostly empty except for some old straw scattered across the floor and a broken wagon wheel leaning against the far wall. A ladder led up to a hayloft that looked relatively intact. Thomas was about to turn back to his wagon when he heard it. A tiny sound, barely audible, like a sharp intake of breath. He froze, every sense suddenly alert. There it was again, coming from the hayloft. His hand tightened on the rifle, though he kept it pointed at the ground. "I know someone is up there," he called out, his voice firm but not threatening. "I am the new owner of this property. You need to show yourself." Silence. Then the sound of movement, straw rustling. Thomas took a few steps forward, positioning himself where he could see the loft more clearly. A face appeared at the edge, pale and wide-eyed, framed by tangled dark hair. It was a young woman, and she looked absolutely terrified. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse and desperate. "Please do not hurt me." Thomas immediately lowered his rifle, holding up one hand in a peaceful gesture. "I am not going to hurt you. What are you doing out here? Are you alone?" She did not answer, just stared at him with those huge, frightened eyes. She looked thin, too thin, and her dress was torn and dirty. Thomas felt a surge of concern mixed with confusion. How long had she been hiding in this barn? "My name is Thomas Trent," he said slowly, keeping his voice gentle. "I just bought this land. I did not know anyone was living here." "Are you hurt? Do you need help? You bought the land." She seemed to process this information with difficulty, as if her mind was struggling through fog. "You are going to stay. That is the plan. I am going to build a ranch here." Thomas took another careful step forward. "What is your name?" She hesitated, her hands gripping the edge of the loft so tightly her knuckles were white. "Jane," she finally said. "Jane Vance." "Miss Vance, when was the last time you ate something?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. Her eyes filled with tears and she shook her head. "I do not remember. A few days, maybe. I have been drinking from the creek, but there is no food." Thomas felt his chest tighten. Whatever had brought this young woman to hide alone in an abandoned barn, she was clearly in trouble. "I have food in my wagon. Good food. Bread, dried beef, beans, coffee. You are welcome to share it. Please come down." She did not move, still watching him with that wary, frightened expression. Thomas realized she had no reason to trust him. Out here, alone and vulnerable, she probably saw him as a threat rather than help. "Tell you what," he said, backing toward the door. "I am going to go back to my wagon and start a fire. I will cook something and you can decide if you want to join me or not. No pressure. But Miss Vance, you look like you could use a good meal and some kindness." He turned and walked out of the barn without waiting for a response, giving her space to think. His mind was racing as he set about making camp near the wagon. Who was Jane Vance? Why was she hiding in that barn, alone and starving? The way she had flinched when she first saw him suggested someone had hurt her, frightened her badly enough that she would rather hide in the wilderness than seek help in town. Thomas built a small fire ring with stones and got a blaze going with practiced efficiency. He filled his coffee pot from one of the water barrels on the wagon and set it to boil, then started preparing a simple but hearty meal. Beans into the pot, along with some salt pork for flavor. He sliced bread and laid out dried apples. The smell of cooking food drifted across the clearing, and he hoped it would be enough to coax her out. He was pouring himself a cup of coffee when he heard the soft crunch of footsteps. Jane emerged from the barn like a wild creature, ready to bolt at any sudden movement. She was younger than he had initially thought, probably only about 21 or 22, with delicate features beneath the grime and exhaustion. Her dress had once been a nice one, he noticed, the kind a respectable young woman might wear to church or a social gathering. Now it was faded and torn, the hem caked with mud. "There is enough for both of us," Thomas said quietly. not looking directly at her. He had learned from working with skittish horses that sometimes not making eye contact helped. "Have a seat if you like." She moved closer in small, hesitant steps until she was near enough to feel the warmth of the fire. Thomas ladled beans onto a tin plate and set it down on a relatively flat stone, along with a piece of bread. He poured coffee into a second cup and placed it beside the plate, then moved back to give her room. Jane sank down near the fire and picked up the plate with shaking hands. She ate like someone starving, which she clearly was, but she tried to maintain some dignity, taking measured bites even though he could see she wanted to devour it all at once. Thomas ate his own meal slowly, letting the silence stretch between them. She needed time, and he had plenty of it. When she had finished eating, she looked up at him for the first time with something other than fear in her eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I did not expect kindness. You are welcome." Thomas refilled her coffee cup. "Miss Vance, I do not want to pry, but I need to understand the situation here. Are you in some kind of trouble? Is someone looking for you?" Her face went pale, and for a moment he thought she might run. But then her shoulders sagged and she looked down at her hands. "I ran away," she whispered. "3 weeks ago. I have been hiding here since then." "Ran away from what?" She was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "My father sold me to a man named Garrett Pierce. He is a rancher down near Roswell, wealthy and powerful. My father owed him money, gambling debts, and Pierce said he would forgive everything if my father would give him my hand in marriage." Thomas felt anger coil in his gut. "Your father agreed to this," he said. "I did not have a choice. That it was decided. Pierce is 43 years old and has buried 2 wives already. Everyone knows he is cruel, that he beats his workers and his animals. The women in town whisper about what happened to his wives, though no one will say it outright." She looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I could not do it. I could not marry him. So the night before the wedding I took a horse and I ran." "Does Pierce know where you went?" "I do not think so. I was careful. I rode south first to throw off anyone following, then circled back north. I knew about this abandoned property because my mother used to bring me this way when I was younger, before she died. She said it was beautiful land that just needed someone to love it." A tear slid down her cheek. "I thought I could hide here until Pierce gave up looking, or until I figured out somewhere else to go. But the horse ran off 2 days after I got here, and I have been alone ever since." Thomas absorbed this information, his mind working through the implications. Garrett Pierce. He had heard that name before, knew the man's reputation. Pierce was exactly the kind of man who would not take kindly to being humiliated by a runaway bride. If he found Jane here, there was no telling what he might do. "You did the right thing," Thomas said firmly. "No woman should be forced into a marriage, especially to a man like that." She looked at him with surprise, as if she had not expected him to take her side so readily. "You believe me? Why would you lie? You have been hiding in a barn, alone and starving. That tells me you were desperate enough to risk everything rather than go through with that wedding." He poured himself more coffee, thinking. The question now is what to do next. "I will leave," Jane said quickly, starting to stand. "I should not have stayed this long. This is your land now, and I have no right to be here. I will not bring my troubles to your door. Sit down, Miss Vance." Thomas's voice was gentle but firm. "You are not going anywhere in your condition. You can barely stand, you have no horse, no supplies, and no plan. Running off into the wilderness is not going to solve anything. But Pierce does not know you are here. And even if he comes looking, he has no authority to search my property without cause." Thomas met her eyes steadily. "You are welcome to stay here as long as you need." I could use help getting this place in order anyway. Can you cook? Handle basic ranch work? She nodded slowly. My mother taught me to cook and sew and tend a garden. I know how to preserve food, make soap, care for chickens. I am not afraid of hard work. Then we have an arrangement. You help me get this ranch established, and in return you have a safe place to stay. If Pierce or anyone else comes around asking questions, you are my hired help. Nothing more, nothing less. Jane stared at him as if he were some kind of miracle. You would do that. You do not even know me. I know enough. I know you are brave enough to run from a bad situation and stubborn enough to survive 3 weeks alone in an abandoned barn. That tells me you are exactly the kind of person who can make it out here. He allowed himself a small smile. Besides, I could genuinely use the help. Building a ranch from nothing is not a one-person job. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dirt across her cheek. I do not know what to say. Say you will stay, at least for now, until we figure out a better plan. All right. Her voice was stronger now, steadier. All right, I will stay, and Mr. Trent, thank you, truly. Call me Thomas. If we are going to be working together, we might as well be on friendly terms. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, the first hint of anything other than fear or despair that he had seen from her. Then you should call me Jane. They spent the rest of that day setting up a proper camp. Thomas had packed a large canvas tent that he erected near the barn, and he insisted Jane take it while he made do with sleeping under the wagon. She protested, but he would not hear otherwise. It was not proper for a young woman to be without shelter, even out here where society's rules seemed distant and unimportant. As they worked together, Thomas found himself watching Jane with a mixture of curiosity and growing respect. Despite her obvious exhaustion and recent ordeal, she jumped into every task with determination. She helped him unload the wagon, organized his supplies in the barn, and even suggested the best place to dig a fire pit based on wind patterns she had observed during her weeks of hiding. By the time the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the New Mexico sky in shades of orange and deep purple, they had established the basic framework of a camp. It was not much, but it was a start. Thomas cooked dinner while Jane cleaned herself up as best she could with water from the creek and a spare shirt he offered her. When she emerged from the tent, her hair brushed and her face scrubbed clean, he was struck by how pretty she actually was. Her eyes were a remarkable shade of green, and despite the hardship written in the lines of her face, there was an underlying strength and grace that commanded attention. "Better?" he asked. "Much better. I feel almost human again." She sat by the fire, accepting the plate he offered. "Thomas, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you buy this land? Everyone says it is worthless." He stirred the fire with a stick, watching the sparks rise into the darkening sky. "Because everyone is wrong. This land has potential. It just needs someone who can see it, someone willing to put in the work." He glanced at her. "Kind of like people, I suppose. Just because something or someone looks rough on the outside does not mean there is no value underneath." Jane was quiet for a moment. "You are not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I do not know, but you are kind. That is rare, especially out here. My mother raised me to treat people with decency and respect. She died when I was 16, but her lessons stuck." Thomas poked at the fire again. "She would have liked you, I think. She always said you could tell the measure of a person by how they handled adversity." "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was. My father, too, before the war took him. They were good people who deserved better than they got." He shook off the melancholy that threatened to settle over him. "But that is the way of the world sometimes. We do not get to choose our circumstances, only how we respond to them." They talked late into the night, the conversation flowing more easily than Thomas would have expected given the strange circumstances of their meeting. Jane told him about growing up in a small homestead south of Roswell, about her mother who had died of fever when Jane was 15, leaving her alone with a father who increasingly turned to gambling and drink to numb his grief. Thomas shared stories from his years on the cattle drives, the places he had seen, the plans he had for his new ranch. In the days that followed, they fell into a routine that felt surprisingly natural. Thomas began the hard work of repairing the barn and making it weather-tight, while Jane took charge of the camp and started planting a small garden in a spot where the soil looked promising. They worked from sunrise to sunset, the physical labor exhausting but satisfying in a way neither of them had experienced before. Thomas found himself increasingly impressed by Jane's capabilities. She seemed to have an intuitive understanding of the land, knowing where to plant what and how to coax the most from their limited resources. She made soap from ashes and animal fat, mended his worn clothes with neat stitches, and cooked meals that transformed their basic supplies into something genuinely good. More than that, she approached every challenge with a determination that matched his own. A week after her arrival, Thomas made a trip into Chisum Ranch for more supplies. He was careful about what he said to people, mentioning only that he had hired someone to help with the ranch work. The townspeople were too busy gossiping about other matters to pay much attention, though the general store owner did raise an eyebrow when Thomas bought fabric clearly meant for a woman's dress. "Got yourself a wife already, Trent?" the man asked with a knowing grin. "Just a hired hand," Thomas replied evenly. "Everyone needs proper clothes for ranch work." He also made discreet inquiries about Garrett Pierce, learning that the man had indeed been searching for his runaway bride but seemed to have given up and returned to his ranch near Roswell. The general consensus was that Jane Vance had probably died somewhere in the wilderness, unable to survive on her own. Thomas let people believe what they wanted. It was safer for Jane that way. When he returned to the ranch, he found Jane had made remarkable progress on the garden. She had also cleaned out one of the barn stalls and turned it into a surprisingly cozy living space, complete with a makeshift bed of straw covered with blankets. "What is this?" Thomas asked, setting down the supplies. "You cannot sleep under that wagon forever," Jane said practically. "The barn is sturdy enough now, and this stall is actually quite comfortable. I thought we could both use the barn. I will take the loft. You can have this stall. It is more proper that way and more comfortable for both of us." Thomas had to admit she was right. That night, for the first time since arriving at his new property, he slept under an actual roof. It was a small thing, but it felt significant somehow, like they were really building something here. As spring turned toward summer, the ranch began to take shape. Thomas repaired the barn completely and built a sturdy chicken coop, using wood he hauled from town. Jane traded some of her sewing work with a neighboring homesteader for 6 hens and a rooster, and soon they had fresh eggs every morning. The garden flourished under Jane's careful tending, producing lettuce, beans, squash, and even a few precious tomato plants. Thomas noticed other changes too, more subtle but no less significant. Jane was putting on healthy weight, the hollow look leaving her face. She smiled more often, and sometimes he even heard her singing while she worked. The fear that had haunted her eyes was gradually being replaced by something else, something that looked like hope. For his part, Thomas found himself looking forward to the end of each workday, when he and Jane would sit by the fire and talk. She was smart and funny when she let her guard down, with opinions on everything from politics to philosophy. They debated the merits of various farming techniques, argued good-naturedly about the best way to train a horse, and shared stories about their pasts that helped them understand each other better. It was during one of these evening conversations, about 6 weeks after Jane's arrival, that Thomas realized he was falling in love with her. The recognition hit him suddenly, watching her laugh at some joke he had made, the firelight dancing in her eyes. It was not just that she was beautiful, though she certainly was. It was everything about her, the strength and resilience, the kindness and intelligence, the way she had transformed his rough camp into something that felt like home. The realization terrified him. Jane was here because she needed safety, not because she wanted to be courted. She trusted him precisely because he had not made any advances or demands. If he revealed his feelings and she did not share them, it could ruin everything. She might feel obligated to leave, or worse, might stay out of perceived obligation rather than genuine desire. So Thomas kept his feelings to himself, though it grew harder with each passing day. He was careful never to touch her unnecessarily, never to let his gaze linger too long, never to say anything that might make her uncomfortable. But sometimes he caught her watching him with an expression he could not quite read, and he wondered if perhaps she felt something too. One afternoon in early July, Thomas was working on building a proper corral when he heard horses approaching. He straightened immediately, reaching for the rifle he now kept close while working. Jane emerged from the barn, her face going pale as she recognized the sound. 3 riders came into view, and Thomas's jaw tightened when he recognized the man in the lead. Garrett Pierce was exactly what Thomas had expected, a thick-bodied man with cold eyes and a cruel set to his mouth. The 2 men flanking him looked like hired guns, hard cases who lived by violence. "This the Trent place," Pierce called out, reining in his horse about 20 feet from where Thomas stood. "It is. What can I do for you?" Thomas kept his voice neutral, though his hand stayed near his rifle. Pierce's eyes swept over the property before landing on Jane, who stood frozen near the barn entrance. His expression transformed into something ugly and triumphant. "Well now, I heard a rumor that someone fitting my runaway bride's description might be working out here." "Looks like those rumors were true. Miss Vance is my hired employee," Thomas said evenly. "She has been working here for nearly 2 months now. Miss Vance is promised to me." Pierce dismounted, his men following suit. "Her father made an agreement, signed a contract. She belongs to me." "I belong to no one," Jane said, her voice shaking but determined. She moved to stand beside Thomas. "I never agreed to that contract. My father had no right to sell me like property." Pierce's face darkened. "Your father had gambling debts. I forgave those debts in exchange for your hand." "That makes it a legal contract, little girl, and you broke that contract when you ran away." "A contract signed under duress is not legally binding," Thomas interjected. "Miss Vance has made it clear she does not wish to marry you, Mr. Pierce. I suggest you respect her decision and leave." Pierce laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "You suggest? Who the hell are you to suggest anything? This does not concern you, Trent. It concerns me when someone threatens my employee on my property." Thomas shifted slightly, putting himself more fully between Pierce and Jane. "Miss Vance is under my protection. If you have a legal grievance, take it to the territorial court, but you are not taking her off this ranch." "Is that so?" Pierce's hand moved toward the gun at his hip, and his men did the same. "You seem mighty protective of hired help." "Makes a man wonder if there is more going on here than just employment." "What I do on my own land is my business," Thomas replied, his voice hardening. "But since you seem to need things spelled out clearly, I will say it plain. Jane Vance is staying here of her own free will. She is not your bride, not your property, not your concern. If you or your men set 1 foot further onto my land without permission, I will consider it trespassing and act accordingly." The tension stretched like a wire about to snap. Pierce's men had their hands on their guns, and Thomas knew he was outgunned. But he also knew backing down would mean losing Jane, and that was not something he was prepared to do. It was Jane who broke the stalemate. She stepped forward, her head held high despite the fear Thomas knew she must be feeling. "Mr. Pierce, I am sorry for the embarrassment I caused you, but I cannot marry you. I will never marry you. My father had no right to promise me to anyone without my consent, and I do not give that consent. Please, just let me go. Find someone who actually wants to be your wife." Pierce stared at her for a long moment, and Thomas saw something dangerous flicker in the man's eyes. "You think you can just run away from your obligations? You think hiding behind this cowboy is going to save you?" "She is not hiding," Thomas said quietly. "She is standing right here telling you no. That should be enough for any decent man." "Decent," Pierce spat the word. "I have been made a laughing stock. My bride runs away, everyone whispers and gossips, and you think I should just accept that?" "There are consequences for humiliation, Trent, consequences for both of you." "Is that a threat?" "It is a promise." Pierce swung back into his saddle, his men following suit. "You have not heard the last of this, mark my words." They rode off in a cloud of dust, leaving Thomas and Jane standing in tense silence. As soon as the riders disappeared from view, Jane's legs seemed to give out. Thomas caught her before she fell, supporting her weight as he helped her sit on a nearby crate. "I am sorry," she whispered, her whole body shaking. "I am so sorry. I should have left before he found me. Now I have brought trouble to you." "Stop that." Thomas knelt in front of her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "You did nothing wrong. Pierce is the one in the wrong, and I will not let him take you. But you heard him. He is going to come back, and next time he might bring more men. Thomas, he could hurt you. He could kill you. I cannot have that on my conscience. Then it is a good thing you do not get to make that choice." He waited until she looked at him, her green eyes swimming with tears. "I am not going to let anything happen to you, Jane. I promise you that." "Why?" The question came out broken. "Why would you risk so much for me?" "Because I love you," Thomas thought, but he could not say the words. Not now, not like this, when she was vulnerable and scared. So instead he said, "Because it is the right thing to do. Because you deserve better than being forced into a life you do not want. And because I need you here. This ranch, everything we have been building, it would not exist without you. You are not just hired help, Jane. You are my partner in this." She closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. Thomas pulled her into his arms, holding her while she cried out her fear and relief. He stroked her hair and murmured reassurances, and tried to ignore how perfectly she fit against him, how right it felt to hold her. That night, neither of them slept well. Thomas kept watch in shifts with Jane, both of them alert for any sign of Pierce's return. But the night passed quietly, and by morning Thomas had formulated a plan. "I am going into town," he told Jane over breakfast. "I am going to talk to the marshal, make sure he knows what happened here yesterday. If Pierce is making threats, that needs to be on record. Will the marshal help us?" Jane asked doubtfully. "Pierce is rich and powerful. I am nobody." "You are not nobody," Thomas said firmly. "And the law is supposed to protect everyone, not just the wealthy. Marshal Henderson is a decent man. He will listen." Thomas made the ride into Chisum Ranch and found Marshal Henderson in his office, a small building near the center of town. The marshal was in his 50s, a weathered man with sharp eyes and a reputation for fairness. "Mr. Trent," Henderson greeted him. "What brings you to town?" Thomas explained the situation carefully, leaving nothing out. He told the marshal about Jane's background, her flight from Pierce, and the confrontation at his ranch. Henderson listened without interrupting, his expression growing increasingly serious. "That is a complicated situation," the marshal said when Thomas finished. "Problem is, Pierce does have a signed contract with Jane's father. Now, you are right that a woman cannot be forced into marriage against her will, but Pierce could argue that the father had legal authority to make that agreement on behalf of his underage daughter." "Jane is 22 years old," Thomas said. "She was of legal age when that contract was signed." "Her father had no authority. Then that changes things." Henderson leaned back in his chair. "If she was an adult, she had to consent to the marriage herself. A father cannot sign away an adult daughter like property." He paused. "But Thomas, you need to understand something. Pierce is not going to let this go. Men like him, they see women as possessions and they do not take kindly to having their possessions escape. He is going to keep pushing this. I know. That is why I am here. I want it on record that he came to my ranch making threats. If something happens to me or Jane, you will know who is responsible." Henderson nodded slowly. "I will make a note of it, and Thomas, be careful. Pierce has money and connections. If he decides to come at you hard, he has the resources to make your life very difficult." "Noted. But Marshal, I am not backing down on this. Jane deserves to live her own life, make her own choices. I will do whatever it takes to protect that right." "I respect that. Just do not do anything foolish. If Pierce breaks the law, you come to me. Do not try to handle it yourself." Thomas agreed. Though they both knew that out on an isolated ranch, the law was often too far away to matter when trouble came calling. He made a few other stops in town, buying ammunition and a second rifle, along with more supplies. He also stopped by the land office to officially register Jane as an employee of his ranch, creating a paper trail that might offer some legal protection. When he returned to the ranch in the late afternoon, he found Jane had not been idle. She had reinforced the chicken coop and moved the birds into the barn for safety, and she had organized their supplies so they could be quickly loaded onto the wagon if they needed to make a fast escape. She had also been practicing with his spare pistol, setting up targets behind the barn. "I am not helpless," she said when she saw his surprised expression. "My father taught me to shoot when I was young before the gambling took over his life. I am rusty, but it is coming back." "That is good," Thomas said, meaning it. "I hope we never need it, but it is better to be prepared." They spent the next few days in a state of heightened alert, but Pierce did not return. Thomas began to hope that maybe the man had decided to cut his losses and move on. They continued working on the ranch, and slowly the tension began to ease. It was Jane who suggested they ride out to check the northern boundary of the property, where Thomas had seen signs of a natural spring during his initial survey of the land. They saddled up his horse, riding double since Jane's mount had long since disappeared, and headed north in the relative cool of early morning. The spring turned out to be even better than Thomas had hoped. Water bubbled up from between layers of rock, creating a small pool that overflowed into a narrow creek. The area around it was lush with grass and wildflowers, a startling contrast to the drier terrain of the rest of the property. "This is beautiful," Jane breathed, sliding down from the horse. She knelt by the pool, trailing her fingers through the clear water. "Thomas, with this water source you could support cattle, real herds, not just a few head." "We could support cattle," he corrected gently. "This is as much your ranch as mine now, Jane." She looked up at him, something vulnerable and hopeful in her expression. "Do you really mean that?" Thomas dismounted and crouched beside her. "I mean it. You have put your blood, sweat, and tears into this place. It would not be what it is without you. As far as I am concerned, you are a full partner here." "Thomas, I need to tell you something." Jane stood up, wrapping her arms around herself. "When I first came here, I was so broken. I thought my life was over, that I would spend whatever time I had left just surviving, never really living. But you changed that. You gave me hope again. You gave me a reason to believe that maybe the world was not as cruel as I thought. Jane, please, let me finish. She took a deep breath. I know I am here because you were kind enough to help someone in need. I know this started as just an employment arrangement, but somewhere along the way it became more than that for me. This ranch, working beside you every day, building something together, it has made me happier than I have ever been. And it is not just the ranch. It is you, Thomas. I have fallen in love with you, and I know I have no right to feel that way given everything you have already done for me, but I cannot help it. I love you. Thomas felt his heart slam against his ribs. He stared at her, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. You love me? Yes. She laughed shakily. I love you, and if that makes things awkward or complicated, I am sorry, but I could not keep it to myself anymore. I needed you to know. Instead of answering with words, Thomas closed the distance between them and kissed her. Jane made a soft sound of surprise and then melted into him, her arms coming up to wrap around his neck. The kiss was everything Thomas had imagined and more, sweet and fierce and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. I love you too, he said hoarsely. I have loved you for weeks now, maybe from the moment I saw you in that barn. I just did not think I had the right to say anything, given the circumstances. You have every right, Jane whispered. Thomas, you have been nothing but good to me. You have given me safety and respect and partnership. You have made me feel valued, not as property but as a person. How could I not fall in love with you? They kissed again, longer this time, and Thomas felt like every piece of his life was finally falling into place. This woman, this land, the future they could build together, it all suddenly seemed so clear and right. Marry me, he said when they came up for air. Not because of obligation or contracts or anything else. Marry me because you want to, because you love me and I love you. Help me build this ranch into something real, something lasting. Be my partner in every sense of the word. Yes, Jane was crying and laughing at the same time. Yes, Thomas, I will marry you. They spent the rest of that day at the spring, making plans and dreaming about the future. They would start small, buying a few head of cattle once they had built up enough capital. They would expand the garden, maybe build a proper house within the next year. They would create a life together, built on mutual respect and hard work and love. When they returned to the ranch in the late afternoon, they found Garrett Pierce waiting for them. This time he had come alone, and he sat on his horse near the barn with an expression that made Thomas's hand move instinctively toward his gun. But Pierce held up both hands in a gesture of peace. I am not here to cause trouble, he said, though his voice was bitter. I came to say something, and then I will leave you both alone. Say it then, Thomas said warily, keeping himself between Pierce and Jane. Pierce looked at Jane with an expression that might have been regret. I have been a fool. I let my pride and my anger drive me, and I have been making threats I should not have made. The truth is, Miss Vance, you were right to run. I would have made you miserable. I have made 2 women miserable already, and I do not need a 3rd wife to hate me. Jane stepped forward. Mr. Pierce, let me finish, he sighed heavily. I spoke to your father. I told him the debt is forgiven, no conditions. You are free. And for what it is worth, I am sorry. Sorry for trying to buy a wife like you were cattle. Sorry for threatening you and Mr. Trent. It was wrong, all of it. Thomas studied the man carefully, looking for signs of deception, but Pierce seemed genuine. There was a defeated slump to his shoulders, a weariness that spoke of a man who had finally recognized his own failures. I appreciate that, Jane said quietly. And I am sorry, too, for any embarrassment I caused you. You did not cause anything I did not bring on myself. Pierce gathered his reins. You two look happy together. I hope it works out for you. God knows somebody should get a happy ending out of this mess. He rode away without another word, and this time Thomas believed they had seen the last of him. He wrapped his arm around Jane's waist, pulling her close. "Is it really over?" she asked softly. "I think it is. Pierce is not a good man, but he is not evil either. I think he actually meant what he said. Then we are truly free, free to build our life together." "Yes, we are." They were married 3 weeks later in a small ceremony at the church in Chisum Ranch. Marshall Henderson stood as witness, along with a few of the neighbors who had come to respect Thomas's determination and Jane's competence. Jane wore a simple dress she had made herself from the fabric Thomas had bought months before, and she had never looked more beautiful. The minister pronounced them husband and wife, and when Thomas kissed his bride, he felt like the luckiest man in all of New Mexico territory. The years that followed were not easy. Ranch life never was. There were droughts that tested their resilience and harsh winters that made them wonder if they would make it through. But there were also good years, years when the rain came at the right times and the cattle thrived and they prospered beyond their initial dreams. Thomas built Jane the house he had promised, a solid structure with glass windows and a real wood floor. Jane turned the area around the house into a showplace, with flower gardens and a large vegetable plot that produced more food than they could use themselves. They sold the surplus in town, building a reputation for quality produce. They bought their first cattle in the spring of 1879, just 10 head to start. But Thomas had an eye for good stock, and Jane proved to have a natural talent for animal husbandry. By 1882, they had over 100 head, and the Trent Ranch was becoming known throughout the territory as a reliable source for quality beef. They hired help as the ranch grew, taking on a few cowhands who lived in a bunkhouse Thomas built near the barn. Jane treated the workers with the same respect Thomas did, and as a result, they had loyal employees who took pride in their work. In the summer of 1883, Jane told Thomas she was pregnant. He picked her up and spun her around despite her laughing protests, so overwhelmed with joy he could barely speak. Their son was born the following spring, a healthy boy with his mother's green eyes and his father's stubborn chin. They named him Matthew, and from his first breath he was the center of their world. 2 years later, a daughter arrived. Sarah had her father's dark hair and her mother's delicate features, and she wrapped both her parents around her tiny finger from the moment she smiled her first smile. Jane often joked that Sarah would either run the ranch someday or run for territorial governor, because the girl had opinions about everything and the force of will to make those opinions heard. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. The land that everyone had said was worthless proved them all wrong, producing grass and water and opportunity for those willing to work for it. Thomas and Jane became pillars of the community, known for their fairness and generosity. They helped neighbors in need, contributed to the building of a new school in Chisum Ranch, and hosted an annual summer barbecue that became a highly anticipated event. Jane never forgot where she had come from or what Thomas had risked for her. She made sure their children understood the value of kindness and the importance of standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult. She taught Sarah and Matthew that people should be judged by their character, not their circumstances, and that sometimes the greatest strength was simply refusing to give up. Thomas watched his wife with endless admiration as she navigated the challenges of ranch life and motherhood with grace and determination. She was his partner in every sense, helping make decisions about the ranch, handling the books with a precision that impressed their banker, and somehow still finding time to make their house a home filled with love and laughter. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thomas took Jane back to the spring where they had first confessed their love. The children were with the neighbors for the day, giving them a rare moment alone together. They sat by the water, Jane leaning against Thomas's chest while he wrapped his arms around her. "You ever regret it?" Jane asked quietly. "Buying this land, taking in a scared girl hiding in your barn?" "Not for 1 second." Thomas kissed the top of her head. "That was the best $40 I ever spent, and finding you was the greatest blessing of my life. I was so frightened that day. I thought you were going to throw me off the land or turn me over to Pierce. I never imagined you would offer me kindness. I never imagined I would find my soulmate hiding in a hayloft. But life is full of surprises, most of them good if you are open to them." Jane turned in his arms to face him. "I love you, Thomas Trent. I love the life we have built, the family we have created. I love that you saw potential where everyone else saw waste, both in this land and in me." "You were never waste," Thomas said fiercely. "You were a treasure waiting to be found. I am just grateful I was the one who got to find you." They kissed, a sweet familiar kiss that still held all the passion of their early days, and Thomas sent up a silent prayer of thanks for the twist of fate that had brought them together. The years continued to pass, marked by both joy and sorrow, triumph and challenge. They lost the oldest cowhands to age and sickness, but trained new ones who carried on the ranch traditions. They weathered economic downturns and cattle diseases, droughts and floods. Through it all, Thomas and Jane stood together, their partnership as strong as the day they wed. Matthew grew into a capable young man who shared his father's love for ranching. He learned every aspect of the business, from mending fences to negotiating cattle sales, and Thomas knew the ranch would be in good hands when it passed to the next generation. Sarah, true to her mother's prediction, had ambitions beyond the ranch. She was brilliant in school and talked about becoming a teacher or perhaps even studying law. Jane encouraged her daughter's dreams, remembering her own youth when such aspirations had seemed impossible. In 1895, when Thomas was 43 and Jane was 39, they welcomed a surprise third child, another son they named Robert. The baby brought renewed energy to the household, and Sarah and Matthew doted on their little brother with fierce protectiveness. Jane sometimes walked out to the old barn, which they had long since replaced with a larger, more modern structure, but had kept standing as a reminder of where their story began. She would stand in the doorway and remember the terrified young woman she had been, hiding in the loft with no hope for the future. It seemed like another lifetime, another person entirely. Thomas found her there one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. He slipped his hand into hers, and they stood together in comfortable silence. "What are you thinking about?" he finally asked. "About how far we have come. About how different my life could have been if you had not bought this land, if you had not offered me kindness when I needed it most." "You would have survived," Thomas said confidently. "You are the strongest person I know, Jane. You would have found a way, maybe, but I would not have been happy. I would not have had you or our children or this life we have built. I would have just been surviving, not truly living. Well, I am grateful every day that I get to share this life with you." Thomas squeezed her hand. "You know, they are talking about New Mexico becoming a state within the next few years. We will have lived to see the territory become civilized, more or less." Jane laughed. "Civilized is a relative term. But yes, things have changed significantly since we started. Sometimes I miss the wildness of those early days when it was just you and me against the world. I do not miss the part where we slept in a tent and ate beans 3 meals a day," Thomas said with a grin. But I know what you mean. There was something special about those first months, building something from nothing. We are still building, Jane pointed out, just on a larger scale now. They walked back to the house as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Inside, they could hear the sounds of their children, Matthew helping Robert with his reading while Sarah practiced a piece on the piano they had bought her for her last birthday. It was the sound of a happy home, a life well lived. That night, lying in bed with Jane curled against his side, Thomas thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. He thought about the auction where he had bought land no one wanted, about the frightened young woman hiding in the barn, about all the challenges and triumphs that had followed. Every difficult decision, every risk taken, every moment of doubt and fear had been worth it to arrive at this place of contentment and love. "I love you," he whispered into the darkness, not sure if Jane was still awake. "I love you too," she murmured back, her voice drowsy. "Forever, Thomas. I will love you forever." As the years continued to advance, the Trent Ranch became one of the most successful operations in the region. Matthew married a smart young woman from Roswell and brought her to the ranch, where she and Jane became fast friends. They gave Thomas and Jane 4 grandchildren, energetic youngsters who tore around the property with the kind of wild joy only children can manage. Sarah did become a teacher, opening a school in Chisum Ranch that focused on educating both boys and girls to high standards. She married later than expected, at 27, to a lawyer from Santa Fe who respected her intelligence and independence. They divided their time between Santa Fe and the ranch, and Sarah made sure her own children understood their family history and the values that had built their legacy. Robert, the youngest, surprised everyone by showing an aptitude for engineering. He went east to study at a technical college and returned with ideas about modernizing the ranch operations. He installed windmills to pump water more efficiently and designed a new irrigation system that dramatically improved their crop yields. Thomas and Jane watched their children and grandchildren with pride and satisfaction. They had built not just a successful ranch, but a family legacy rooted in hard work, integrity, and love. The land that everyone said was worthless had become a cornerstone of the community, providing jobs and supporting multiple families. In their 60s, Thomas and Jane slowed down a bit, leaving more of the day-to-day operations to Matthew and his family. But they still took long walks around the property together, checking on the cattle, examining the condition of the fences, always planning for the future even as they cherished the present. Jane's hair had gone silver, and Thomas had developed a limp from an old injury that had never quite healed right. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the young people they had been, the cowboy who had taken a chance on worthless land, and the frightened girl who had dared to hope for something better. One spring evening, when Thomas was 70 and Jane was 66, they sat on the porch of the house he had built for her so many years ago. Their great-grandchildren played in the yard, the third generation to call the ranch home. The sun was setting in a blaze of orange and gold, painting the landscape in colors that never failed to take Thomas's breath away. "You remember what you told me that first day?" Jane asked, her hand in his. "When I asked why you bought this land, I said it had potential. That it just needed someone who could see it and was willing to put in the work. You were talking about me too, were you not? Not just the land." Thomas smiled. "Maybe. I saw something special in both, something worth fighting for. And here we are, 52 years later. You were right. About the land and about me." "We were both right," Thomas corrected. "You saw the potential too. You were the one who turned this place into a real home, who made it more than just a ranch." Everything good in my life has come from taking that chance, making that decision to buy land no one wanted and offering help to a scared girl hiding in my barn." "Our barn," Jane said with a gentle smile. "It was always our barn, Thomas. From the very beginning, this was our story." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon and stars began to emerge. Behind them, through the open windows of the house, they could hear their family, multiple generations gathered together for dinner. There was laughter and conversation, the clink of dishes and the patter of small feet. Thomas looked at Jane, this woman who had been his partner through every challenge and triumph, and felt his heart swell with a love that had only deepened over the decades. She had been his salvation just as surely as he had been hers, two broken pieces that had found each other and become whole. "Thank you," he said softly. "For what?" "For choosing to stay. For choosing me. For building this life with me." Jane leaned over and kissed him, a gentle kiss flavored with years of shared history and enduring love. "It was the easiest choice I ever made. You gave me everything, Thomas. Safety, love, partnership, purpose. You gave me a reason to believe in happy endings." "We gave each other that," Thomas said. "Neither of us could have done this alone." As night fell over the ranch that had once been worthless land, Thomas and Jane sat together surrounded by the fruits of their labor and the legacy of their love. The frightened girl who had hidden in the barn was long gone, replaced by a confident woman who had helped build an empire from nothing. The lonely cowboy who had bought land no one wanted had found something more valuable than all the cattle and acreage in the territory. He had found love, partnership, and a family that would carry on long after he was gone. He had found home, not in a place but in a person, in the remarkable woman who sat beside him, and had walked every step of this journey with courage and grace. And as the stars wheeled overhead in the vast New Mexico sky, Thomas Trent knew with absolute certainty that he was the most fortunate man who had ever lived. The gamble on worthless land had paid off beyond his wildest dreams, but the real treasure had been the scared girl in the barn who had trusted him enough to stay, to build, to love. Their story had started with fear and uncertainty, with rejection and loneliness. But it had transformed into something beautiful and lasting, a testament to the power of kindness, courage, and love. They had taken what no one else wanted and turned it into something precious, proving that sometimes the greatest treasures are the ones everyone else overlooks. The ranch would continue for generations, a living monument to what two people could accomplish when they worked together toward a common dream. But more than that, it stood as proof that happy endings were possible, even for those who started with nothing but hope and determination. Thomas and Jane had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, and they had built a love story that would echo through time, inspiring their children and grandchildren to believe in the impossible, to take chances on what others rejected, and to never underestimate the power of offering kindness to someone in need. As they finally rose to go inside and join their family for dinner, Thomas took one last look at the land spread out before him. The barn where Jane had hidden was still visible in the moonlight, a reminder of where it all began. He smiled, squeezed his wife's hand, and walked into the warmth and light of home, grateful beyond measure for the day he had bought the land no one wanted and found the greatest gift of his life hiding in an abandoned barn.